You're sitting in your car, engine running. Maybe you're parked outside your home. Maybe you're on the side of the road after a routine stop. Nothing feels unusual, and yet, in that exact moment, one small detail, something you may not think twice about, can completely change how the law sees you. Not because you intended to break any rule, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the legal system treats firearms inside vehicles in a way most people don't fully understand. And now, after a unanimous Supreme Court ruling, the way your rights apply in that situation has become even more important to get right. So let me ask you this, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If you legally keep a firearm in your car, do you believe that alone gives police the right to search your vehicle without your permission? Take a moment and really think about that. Because the answer sits at the intersection of multiple constitutional protections, and misunderstanding it can have real consequences. What we're discussing today is not a single new law passed overnight, but the broader legal impact of a unanimous Supreme Court decision that reinforces how constitutional rights apply when firearms are present in vehicles. When the court rules 9-0, it signals a strong agreement on legal reasoning, even if the specific facts of the case are narrow. And in my legal analysis, those decisions often shape how future interactions between citizens and law enforcement are interpreted. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the structure of the Constitution itself. The Fourth Amendment protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. That protection extends to your vehicle, but not in the same way it applies to your home. Over time, the Supreme Court developed what is known as the automobile exception. This doctrine recognizes that vehicles are mobile and can be quickly moved out of a jurisdiction, which allows officers, under certain conditions, to search without a warrant. But that exception is not unlimited. There is a strong constitutional argument that the core requirement of probable cause still applies. In other words, law enforcement must have a reasonable basis to believe that a crime has been committed or that evidence of a crime is present in the vehicle. Now here is where the presence of a firearm becomes legally significant. For many years, courts have been asked to consider whether simply having a firearm in a vehicle creates probable cause. And the emerging legal consensus is increasingly clear. In my legal analysis, lawful possession of a firearm does not automatically justify a search. Courts would likely examine whether there are additional factors, specific behaviors, contextual clues, or legal violations that go beyond mere possession. Because if lawful possession alone were enough, it would effectively weaken Fourth Amendment protections for anyone exercising their Second Amendment rights. And that brings us directly to the Second Amendment itself. The Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual constitutional right. Recent decisions have emphasized that this right is not limited to the home, but extends to lawful carry in public, subject to certain regulations. There is a strong constitutional argument that when someone is lawfully exercising that right, it should not be treated as inherently suspicious. However, courts also recognize that law enforcement has a legitimate interest in ensuring safety during encounters. Traffic stops are considered inherently unpredictable. Officers are permitted to take reasonable steps to maintain control of the situation. Courts would likely examine whether those steps are proportionate and grounded in objective facts. In my legal analysis, the balance between individual rights and officer safety is one of the most important and most delicate areas of modern constitutional law. Now let's consider the Fifth Amendment. During a traffic stop or any interaction with law enforcement, you are required to provide identification and comply with lawful commands. But you are not required to answer questions that could incriminate you. The challenge is that many people don't recognize where that boundary exists. They speak freely. They try to explain. They attempt to clarify situations that don't actually require explanation. And in doing so, they sometimes create legal exposure where none previously existed. In my legal analysis, controlled communication is essential. Answer what is required. Remain respectful. Avoid unnecessary statements, because once something is said, it becomes part of the legal record. Now let's look at how federal and state laws interact in this context. Firearm regulations vary significantly across states. Some states require immediate disclosure if you are carrying a firearm during a stop. Others do not. Some require permits. Others allow permitless carry, but constitutional protections apply nationwide. This creates a layered system where your rights remain consistent, but your obligations can change depending on where you are. Courts would likely examine both the state-specific requirements and the broader constitutional framework when evaluating any interaction. Now consider the real-world impact. You are pulled over for a minor traffic issue. During the interaction, the presence of a firearm becomes known. Maybe you disclose it because the law requires you to. Maybe it becomes visible. At that moment, the situation shifts, not necessarily into something negative, but into something more legally complex. In my legal analysis, the outcome of that interaction often depends less on the law itself and more on how well it is understood by both parties. If the driver understands their rights and responsibilities, the interaction remains controlled. If the officer acts within constitutional limits, the legal integrity of the stop is maintained. But if either side misunderstands the boundaries, complications arise. Now let's talk about legal risks. Failure to comply with state-specific firearm laws, such as disclosure requirements, can result in penalties, even if the firearm is otherwise legal. Providing inconsistent or unnecessary statements can create Fifth Amendment concerns. Misunderstanding your rights can lead to unintended consent or escalation. These are not theoretical issues, they are practical realities. Supporters of current legal standards argue that allowing officers to act on reasonable suspicion and maintain control during stops is essential for public safety. And there is validity in that position. Traffic stops are dynamic situations. Officers must make quick decisions based on limited information. However, critics emphasize the importance of maintaining strong constitutional protections, particularly when lawful conduct, such as firearm possession, is involved. In my legal analysis, both perspectives are valid. The legal system must balance safety with liberty. And that balance is constantly being tested through real-world interactions and court decisions. Now let's talk about the significance of a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. When the court rules 9-0, it sends a powerful signal about the clarity of the legal principle involved. It suggests that, at least in that specific context, there is strong agreement across different judicial philosophies. Courts would likely rely on that reasoning in future cases, applying it to new situations as they arise. That means the implications extend far beyond a single case. Looking ahead, the long-term impact is clear. As more individuals lawfully carry firearms, interactions with law enforcement will continue to increase. As those interactions increase, the need for clarity, both legal and practical, becomes more important. And as courts continue to interpret these situations, the boundaries of constitutional protection will become more refined. So what does this mean for you right now? It means understanding that your rights remain intact, but they are not self-executing. They depend on awareness. They depend on conduct. They depend on how you respond in real time. Because in that moment, when you're sitting in your car, when the situation feels routine, when everything seems ordinary, that's when the law is already in motion, and what you do next matters. If this helped you understand how quickly a simple situation can turn into a constitutional one, subscribe for more clear, real-world legal insights. And share your thoughts in the comments, because informed discussion is how people stay prepared. Know the law before the moment comes, because when it does, your understanding is the only thing you'll have time to rely on.